I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the concepts that generate jail designs, just as preparation to showing you the pictures. Some of the key drivers of jail design, one of the first would be jail standards. You have state standards. Washington State Jail Commission has standards that we have to meet. There are also national professional standards. They're not mandatory, but they represent, I think, what we could appropriately call agreed upon best practices by the correctional professionals, detention and correction professionals. These are published by the American Correctional Association. There is federal legislation called PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which needs to be taken into account to make sure that the design helps you to comply with that. And finally, I think we all know about ADA and accessibility standards, which have to be met. And then, of course, there are building codes, but any building has building codes. I'm talking about the things here that are special to jails. And then the kind of special design objectives that apply to jails. And I'm mentioning what some of these could be. These would be objectives that would come out of the process of planning. But among them, I think you can count on security and safety being right up there at the highest level. We're dealing with dangerous and potentially dangerous people, people who can be violent. We have to make sure that staff is safe. We have to make sure that inmates are safe from each other and in some cases safe from themselves. So everything about the jail design has to contribute to security and safety, number one. Number two, and I mentioned it earlier, but again, it has to be emphasized because it's so important that all the decisions that are made have to contribute to operational efficiency, and more than anything else, that means staffing efficiency. So every decision that's made that affects the need for a staff person, either in a fixed location or moving around, has to be carefully considered, and its cost has to be taken into account. And then there are other kinds of goals, for example, what we're trying to achieve, other than just keeping people from escaping and killing each other and themselves while they're in jail. And many jails have aspirations to try to help the inmates who are there address some of the issues that have caused them to be there, to live outside the law to some extent or to a greater extent, and try to do some work on rehabilitation and get them ready for reentry and effectively living in society with the hope and expectation that they won't be back visiting again. So the provision of program space, for example, various kinds of treatment programs, all need to be taken into account. And then there are other things. I'm going to show you pictures of quite a number of jails that have thought a lot about what the quality of the jail environment ought to be like. And believe me, this is not something that people were thinking much about 30 or 40 years ago. But they're thinking a lot about it now, and the reason is that not only does a stress-reducing environment make the jail a place that's easier to manage, easier to run, less violence, less vandalism, and therefore less costs. But it's also a place where staff work. And staff, especially in a jail, which is a short-term facility, staff are going to be spending a lot more time over the course of their careers in the jail than the inmates are. And we have to think about what it's like for them to work there and what we can do to reduce the stress of what is inherently a rather, or sometimes very, stressful job.
Jim,
so,
can I ask you a question?
I wish you would.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the operational efficiency of a one-story, sort of what we're calling a horizontal jail versus a multi-story or vertical jail?
Yes. First of all, let's say what isn't affected by it so much, okay? I think there are a number of components the design of which is important because it affects staffing efficiency, but it doesn't really depend so much if it's spread out or if it's stacked up, okay? So, for example, not very affected by the configuration overall would be the process of booking, say, intake and release. It's going to be designed to be internally efficient, and people are going to go from there wherever they go in the jail. Also, not very much affected by vertical versus horizontal, as long as you've got a reasonable piece of land and it's not building a needle, you know, is the configuration of the housing units. If you can design a housing unit or a group of housing units that are efficient to staff, you can stack them up or you can spread them out. Okay? Also, and I'm going to talk about it as a principle of jail planning, there are two different general approaches to the way inmates move in a facility or don't move in a facility. I'm planning to talk about it later, but I'll just talk about it now. One is unit management. That means that the inmate pretty much stays in the housing unit once they're there, and services come to the inmate. So there's going to be an outdoor recreation courtyard associated with the housing unit. There's going to be a medical exam room, either part of the unit or part of a group of units. There's going to be a classroom right there so that inmates can go to a class or participate in a program without moving much through the jail. The other approach is that the inmates move to the services, and that's kind of, if you have any idea about prison design, it's a little bit more like most prisons are, where the prisoners can go out for a medical appointment, or they can go out to take a class or work in an industry or something like that. And that's a little harder to do anyway in a vertical jail than it is in a horizontal jail, should you want to, okay? So what's left that's affected principally by the horizontal versus vertical? In a vertical jail, it's compact, the distances are short. We have generally found that, like, say, response time to an emergency by staff can be shorter in a compact or vertical jail than in a horizontal one. You have to run 5 blocks to get from one end to the other. You do have to do stairs, though. So, but the movement of inmates when they do have to be moved, I think, would be the main difference in how that's controlled. So how are you handling visiting? Are you doing it by video, for example, where the inmates stay in their housing unit? Then that doesn't really, you're not worried about moving them to that. You do move them at least once, usually from the booking area to a housing unit, and at least once back, or if they go out to court, you're going to move them. But we've found that for inmates up to kind of medium security who don't need to be escorted by staff, that they can move either horizontally or vertically without escort. So you have staff controlling that movement and observing it, either watching it on a camera or watching it with their eyes directly as inmates walk up and down a corridor, or watching a camera that tracks them in an elevator. So I think that, and I know this is a contentious discussion here, and I know that you've had people come in and say that the horizontal, and I don't know if you've heard, have you heard this? That the horizontal is more efficient than the vertical?
Yeah, I've heard that.
You have heard it. And I think I just want to say that it really depends on looking at the operations and the design, and I'm not convinced that it's a foregone conclusion that horizontal is much more efficient than vertical. I'm not convinced. I think you'd have to look at the specific instance. I did a little looking around just before coming here at some of the information that the National Institute of Corrections had published on this question. They have a jail design guide, which is useful reading for anybody who's involved in the process, and probably boring for everybody else. But they did make a statement about. I wish I could give it to you verbatim, but it was carefully couched, and it essentially said something like, for small and medium-sized jails, the question of going vertical should be studied very carefully, because it may be more expensive. So then I went to see what small and medium-sized jails were, and I had to look in a different publication of the NIC to get it, but small and medium jails ranged from 20 to 200 beds. So your jail probably certainly is larger than that. So I think the answer is, to me, that it's not a foregone conclusion. So I know you've heard different things than that, but I've tried to give you some of the reasoning that I have. I ought to be clear, I'm not taking any kind of a position about whether you should or shouldn't go horizontal or vertical. I'm just trying to answer your question.
That was a great answer.
Okay. Oh.
Thank you. And you're not in trouble, I don't think, with that.
Well, we'll find. I don't know. We'll see.